if you don't have any friends, then you're kind of like cut off in terms of, building any foundation for yourself, I think. So allyship requires, you can sign the petition, you should go to meetings where you're welcome. By the way, if they don't talk to you 3 or 4 times, you have to keep showing up until they know you're sincere about wanting to be an ally. You need to be able to contribute if you can, whatever. If it's money or goods or, your talent, that would be helpful. And you have to study. It's another thing that you have to learn and make relationships. All of these things take time.
Good evening and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, President of the Boston Public Library and your host and moderator for tonight's program. Tonight we are gathered again in the Abbey Room of the Central Library here in Copley Square in Boston, and we are joined by an in-person audience and our online audience. Tonight is the third of our Lowell Lecture Series events this season, and is produced in coordination with the GBH Forum Network, the Boston Public Library, and sponsored by the Lowell Institute. Our themes this season are themes of equity, hope, healing, and resilience. Our program this evening will run about 75 to 90 minutes, and will begin in a moment after a short video with conversation between our guest and myself. We will then have time for audience question and answer, taking questions from the registration form, the live audience, and the online live audience as well. And now I'd like to introduce our guest for this evening. Angela Oh came to prominence in 1992 after the civil unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 Los Angeles police officers charged with the beating of Rodney King. As a second-generation Korean-American born in LA, trained as a criminal defense lawyer, active in civil rights and civil liberties organizing, Oh found that her experience gave insight into the causes of what was recorded as the worst civil disaster of the century. In speaking out, her clarity about the political, economic, social, and institutional failures that contributed to the implosion of 1992 resonated with communities across the region. Over 2,000 small family-owned businesses owned by ethnic Koreans were destroyed, and Oh challenged the mainstream media narrative that the crisis in LA was due to Korean and African-American conflict. In '98, she was among 7 presidential appointees on the President's Initiative on Race, led by Professor John Hope Franklin, a historian who dedicated his life's work to examining the effect of slavery on American society. The PIR sought to initiate a national dialogue on race and racism, inviting scholars, community leaders, business leaders, and faith communities to share their insights, knowledge, and experiences. Oh has spent 30 years since the 1992 unrest developing greater clarity about possible futures and pathways to unity and hope. Her search led her to realizations that both violence and the sacred reside at the core of all human society. Her methods for facing the future are shared in the conversations she hosts today. And so, welcome to Angela Oh, and we will now play the opening video. Angela, thank you for sharing that with us. Would you tell us a little bit about what we just watched?
Sure. So after leaving my private practice, I had to go deep into myself, because all of what I witnessed and experienced out of '92, out of the national effort under the leadership of the White House at the time to try and raise up the issue of race in conversations around the country, in speaking with members of the media, philanthropy, educators, all of whom were interested in where do we go from here? What did we learn from both the violence that arose in '92 and the subsequent number of years that people spent trying to build a new kind of consciousness in this country that is quite unique from all others in the world. And we have this message that is very inviting of people to come, and you will find something. There's one group, however, did not come voluntarily, and we have never reckoned with that. We are doing so now. But this set of images, there are actually over 150. It started as a project of 108. We used to call it the 108 Bodhisattva. These are beings that attend to the suffering in the world and dedicate themselves to easing that suffering. And the artist, my spouse, Tutu, is very gifted. These are all pencil drawings. People often see these images and think they're photographs, but they are in fact pencil drawings, and they are part of a meditation process. 45 minutes of quiet, formal sit, pick up the pencil, move into the space, and begin to draw. What you see here is humanity. You'll see presidents of foundations, you'll see healers, you'll see people who have disabilities, you'll see children, you'll see biracial, bicultural children and adults. You'll see people who are dedicating themselves to trying to address the problem of poverty in our society. You'll see religious people. We have 3 of our Zen masters who we trained with in Hawaii that we've included, because each person that Tutu met carried some kind of spirit that was common to all of humanity. He doesn't use other people's photographs. His first medium was photography. So we decided on a project in the early 2000s, I think it was, and it was called The Gift of Compassion. And our idea was we'd like to use art as a portal to introduce people in the West to meditation as a practice. We started doing this ourselves probably 20-some years ago. And today, thankfully, people are seeing that meditation can be very helpful in their day-to-day lives, especially in times like this. So we've worked with people who are coming home from prison. We've worked with children who have come out of the foster system and are what they call transition-aged youth. We have this artificial age of 18. In California, you can stay with the services until you're 23, I think, now. And, suddenly, magically, these children are supposed to live in the world as adults, right? And, of course, in a place like Los Angeles, housing is critically unavailable, and self-medication is one way. It's often the easiest way to handle all of the chaos that comes, right? So
may we just take a moment and acknowledge Tutu for his contribution?
He's right there.
Thank you so much. I'm struck that we often engage these topics as cerebral topics, as intellectual topics, problems to solve. And what you've opened with tonight is music, visualization, things that speak perhaps to a different part of ourselves. Could you talk a little bit about how that different approach has been important to you?
Well, it wasn't planned. It was not at all planned. It was just from, I think, from being in meditation. You know, the whole point of meditation, and the struggle is not around the form. There are many different forms. You could sit on the floor, you could sit on a chair, you could sit on a bar stool for that matter. But really, the hardest thing for many people is how to quiet their mind. So when we introduce this practice, we often show them a device that can be helpful when you first start to meditate. But it was in one of the long meditations. You know, we would have a few times a year what they call a sesshin, which is a 7-day meditation. It goes from about 4:30 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night for the entirety of the time. And the last night, you're supposed to try to stay up all night and not sleep if you're under the age of 42. If you're over 42, you're supposed to go to bed. But the body is really kind of at its limit. The emotions, the spirit kind of are, you know, you're exhausted. You can't fight it with your rational mind anymore. It's just now you got to be with the breath. And I think in that space, I realized that having come off of this project with the White House, the One America Initiative, and engaging people all across the country in dialogue, that dialogue was not helpful. You see, I mean, it has some value when you're first entering this arena where it's important to share conversation and experience and feel welcome and safe to ask questions. But the thing is that, you know, when you get deeper into it and you become more vulnerable and you learn more about things that you've never been told before about our history as a society, then you become angry. And then you become, I think, intolerant of even questions, which is what I have witnessed. And then when you're in a structure, there's this other tendency to decide that the politics of how you're doing the conversation becomes problematic. So you go down this rabbit hole and you lose the whole purpose of engaging. So I think Tutu and I just decided, well, what do you do and what do I do? Okay, Tutu never speaks. That's why he's not sitting right here. He really doesn't like to speak. He's silent most of the time. I, of course, as you can tell, speak. And that was my job. You know, I would take this person that all of my community hated because they did terrible things, right? Everything from homicides to cheating people to petty things, children as well as adults. But my job as a criminal defense lawyer, I always felt, was to humanize my client. I had a lot of questions about how can you defend somebody who killed their mother and sister. Okay, it's not about telling people that they didn't do it. The evidence is pretty clear. But the way our criminal legal system is set up, you have to go to trial sometimes, especially if the prosecution, who is in control, is not offering you anything, and your client is a very young person whose brain isn't even at the point that it should be in their being on this planet. So my job was always to do some very deep digging into who is this person, David. Okay, he's just done this terrible thing. What brought him to this place? So, for example, in that double homicide case, I did not open with my client didn't do it. Okay, the opening was my client did it. But he's charged with first-degree murder. He didn't do that. Right. He didn't even do second-degree murder. And I'm going to argue to you that he didn't even do voluntary manslaughter, you see. And then I proceed to put on the evidence. Why does that matter? Because the prosecution already has his confession, his fingerprints. They found him in the hotel room with all the stuff. And, you know, he basically didn't have many places to go except to fight the ultimate judgment that would be entered. We won that trial with reloading in between, which you never do. And that does not mean he's released. Right. That child will be in prison until he is in his 50s. And then what kind of human being will come out, I don't know.
I think for some of our conversations here, we find it important to get to know the person and the guest as well. And on this last point, I was wondering, as I was reading your background, how much of the criminal defense work was continuous with the mediation and more meditative work that has followed. So I'm just wondering if you'd comment a little and say, was this a natural evolution, or was it more of a break or a change in direction?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question. Okay, but it's a story.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's true. But this is what I think today, sitting here. I had to break from the practice. Why? Because I wasn't a public defender. I was a private lawyer. So my regular retainers were pretty substantial. If you wanted Angela O to come into the courtroom and represent you, I needed anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 as an initial retainer. And I didn't blanch at asking for that. So you can imagine that I had clients that were not the kinds of clients where I had to calculate what would happen when they come back into the system. However, being able to work that way allowed me to support a lot of things financially that I would not have otherwise been able to support. I also realized at a certain point that when you get really good at the practice, you get uglier and uglier cases. And I was meditating on, is this how I want to be in service in this lifetime? And I just decided that while I really respect my colleagues in the defense bar, I mean, look, our most prominent and highly regarded defense lawyer was a deep, deep man of faith. However, I really did not think that I could continue to ask people for the kind of money that I needed to be a part of the practice, nor could I continue to do this work and feel like this was what I was supposed to do in this life. So I had to actually leave, and I was without work for a long time. But the problem for me was everybody knew who Angela O was. As a result, whenever I went knocking on doors to get a job, people would say, no, you're Angela O, you can find a job. This is where fame does not help, right? I still need to pay the rent. I still need to be able to live in this material world. My spiritual teacher, who's now dead for over 15 years, and continues to guide me, he said to me one day as we were having tea, I used to go back to the monastery probably 4 times a year, and he said, as he was serving the tea, there are a lot of good lawyers in the world, aren't there, Angela? Yeah. There aren't that many great teachers, though. And in my mind, I was like, I don't want to be a teacher. My mom was a teacher for 37 years. You know, I really don't want to be a teacher. They're not respected. And plus, I was used to making a certain income, right? Be honest about it. And I'm thinking, teacher. But that wasn't what he meant, right? He meant you have to shift gears. You have to find another way. You can teach and be living in another way. And that's what I needed to do. So I struggled for a few years. You know, I whined to my parents because I didn't have anyone else to whine to. And I'm blessed because they're still alive. My father at 92 and my mother at 90. But I would sit there and they would just look at me because they're immigrants that came out of the war in Korea. And, you know, they didn't know. They just said, you should have been a doctor. You know, this was the thing. We told you, get a job as a doctor. Train to be a dentist if you don't want to be a doctor. You know, those were my options.
So lawyer wasn't part of the...
No, lawyer was not a part of the... They didn't even really understand what is that about. You know, most East Asian cultures don't respect the law. I mean, it's just not... I won't go so far as to say don't respect the law, but there are other ways, what we would call ADR, alternative dispute resolution. The Hawaiians call ho'oponopono, you know, where you sit in circle. This is a very old way to resolve problems, civil or criminal, if you could call it that in our day. So, you know, the transition was difficult, scary. I had to just stop. As one senior lawyer said to me, well, if you're going to leave the practice, you just have to stop. And I had to do that. Another senior lawyer said, well, if you stop, who's going to ever listen to you? You won't have a base. This is the whole kind of thinking that we have in this society, right? If you don't have a base, who would think to listen to you? So that was scary, and then I thought, well, I don't know, let's find out.
So adventurous and scary as well.
Yeah, scary. As one of my friends said, Angela, we saw you running off the edge of the cliff, and then you sprouted wings.
That's a beautiful image. Was the openness to meditation and balance always part of your life, or does it emerge during this period where you're looking for that next chapter at that point in time?
It came after crisis,
yeah.
As it does with most people. Most people don't enter meditation when everything's going fine. I mean, why, right? Everything's fine. Usually it is some crisis. You're diagnosed with a terminal illness. You are with somebody who's diagnosed with a terminal illness. You've just had a major tragedy happen in terms of your ability to survive in this material world. Mm-hmm. You've just been asked to do something that you know is not the right thing, and you don't have the tools to say, no, I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. So when you enter those kinds of spaces, it's what we would call a koan, the unanswerable question. You have to sit with it, and you cannot use your calculating mind. Mm-hmm. You cannot use manipulation. If you do, you'll get stuck every time. Mm-hmm. So what happens is you're kind of feeling like there's no answer, and it's scary. Mm-hmm. Most people would rather stay with a miserable known than allow themselves to be open to the unknown, which I find very interesting, since the unknown could be incredible, right? I feel I have arrived. I'm now 60, how old am I? Tutu, am I 66? I'm 66 going on 67, Tutu's 68 going on 69. So, I feel like I arrived when I was 57 years old. I have a clear memory. I have a lot of younger friends, so they ask me in their 30s and 40s, how do you know it was 57 when you got to... 57 is when I got a job to be a mediator at California's Civil Rights Enforcement Agency. So I see as a steady diet every day, every week, cases that have to do with discrimination, harassment, retaliation, racial violence. I haven't yet seen human trafficking, but that is on the plate because we have a very robust statutory scheme in California to protect people and to prevent those kinds of unhappy events to happen. So, when that happened, it was the first time in my adult life where I actually had vacation. Seriously. In my adult life, I had to bill my time. If I took a week off, that had a real impact because I couldn't bill my time. So I used to say to one friend who would ask me, why don't you travel more? Well, it used to be I was too poor to travel. And then I had the resources, but I had no time, right? Now, I have vacation time, and I have a more modest, much, much more modest salary. I told my parents, my first paycheck was less than half of what I used to make 10 years ago in my private practice. But I have health coverage, and I'm grateful for that. And I have this salary that is enough. It's not incredible, it's enough. And that's the other thing that I have learned in my kind of spiritual journey is because we live here in this country and we sort of lionize the one who has a lot, it's kind of seen as being somehow less than if you just have enough. And yet, I feel in this moment in our evolution that this is what we need to learn in this society. What is enough? Why does somebody really need 4 houses or 7 houses? Why does somebody really need to have, 5 cars when there are only 3 human beings in the household, right? And I know real people who live this way, and I I don't encourage that kind of thing to continue because we can't afford it. We have all the signs of a collapse of civilization right now.
Are you, and this is a question I've asked, and you can dissect the question and throw it away, or you can feel free to pick it up. Are you happy or happier now?
Okay, so that is an overrated state of being. I am quite content, and I have moments of being really happy and joyful, and then I have moments of being very, very sad because I, like everybody else, think, wow, if I had gone into politics when I had the momentum and people wanted, I could be a voice that would be listened to in the Capitol on the Hill. Maybe, you know? I could be much, much more well-positioned to at least engage in the debate about where resources should be directed, especially when it comes to things like people who are unhoused, or people who need mental health services, or children who are coming out of foster, or prisoners who have already paid their debt to society and need to stabilize their lives because the expectation is you need to come back and be a productive member of the community. How do they do that? When they have a felony jacket, they may face deportation. I'm part of a reentry group that focuses on Asians. These men that are coming out now in their 40s were my clients, like they were the age of my clients. And in 2005, I got a grant from that infamous foundation that Bernie Maddox used to fund. But I got a grant that allowed for me and a professor at the University of Hawaii to look at the reentry experience of Asians and Pacific Islanders. And back then, we conducted a number of interviews and looked at the data that were made available to us through the Attorney General's offices in both states. Because in California and Hawaii, we have the most APIs. We were an insignificant percentage of the prison population, but in real numbers, it was significant. And we had a unique situation in that we come from cultures that shame you if you don't color within the lines at all times within a certain amount of time. So this shame factor was something that really wasn't being addressed.
The additional stigma.
Yes,
right?
Yes. Nor was there any ability to really look at how we were going to be able to support, because all of the services really were not oriented to that reality. And so we started to just look at what is the reentry experience of people coming home, and we documented some of that. And out of that grew a consciousness in our community about the criminal legal system. And now there's a group called API Rise, and it's a reentry program for really improving and self-empowerment. And they are fortunate in that at this moment they're getting resources, and they're actually working on ways to support the mostly men coming home.
It's interesting to me that it wasn't so much the work, although I'm sure these are part of the story, it wasn't so much the work you did post the 92
Unrest.
You corrected me the other day.
Disturbance.
The right way. Yes.
Yeah.
Or even the 98 appointment to the Clinton Commission on similar issues, but rather 10 years ago, the civil defense work that you've started to do.
All of it actually, contributed. Sure. All of it. Because, there's no... People always worry about, you can't forget history. No, you can't, because you are history. You also are the future. But the only thing you can work with is right now.
Right.
Correct?
Yes.
So, the past is a memory. The future is an imagination. But you already embody all of that, is the awareness that Tutu and I are trying to bring to people. You already are embodying what has been and what will be. So this is the place from which you must begin to think about what you can and cannot do. And not everyone can do what the next guy does, right?
Right.
Because you don't have the same talent, you don't have the same skill, you don't have the same capacity for ambiguity or being insulted or perhaps even being violated in ways that you don't even want to think about.
Well, I also think we could probably spend a whole conversation on the criminal justice system in this country and its challenges.
I don't call it the criminal justice system.
What would you like to call it?
I call it the criminal legal system. There's no justice in this system as it exists today, unfortunately. People try, but this is one of the language pieces that makes things hard because, no justice, no peace.
Right.
It doesn't make sense what you see. We all saw what happened with Mr. King in '92. But we didn't get a hung jury. We got not guilty verdicts across the board at that time. Now, it took a federal trial to take it to another level. But when people see those kinds of outcomes, Latasha Harlins, this is another death that has continued to be like a scab that gets reopened every year in the anniversary of that shooting. And so, yeah, I don't call it the criminal justice system anymore. I call it the criminal legal system.
And you've shifted the conversation to what I think are one of our 5 crises right now as a society. I mark it in a way that follows the level of awareness that seemed to occur post the killing of George Floyd. We can list any number of names of individuals who were killed through violence in the intervening periods and even before. But I'm wondering if we could just spend a moment thinking about the '92 period and if we are in fact in any different now, any better now when it comes to race relations. And I think we can unpack this with respect to Black Americans and Asian Americans in particular, and the whole landscape of race relations in the U.S.
Okay. First, I want to say that I am mostly content, sometimes happy, often disappointed, because I know we can do better. And so just to answer that question, things haven't changed much. The names and players have changed. We don't have Rodney King today. We have George Floyd as our marker. Mm-hmm. We don't have just the LAPD. Now we have police departments all across the country who are being confronted with calls for defunding, dismantling. That will not happen, but it is the cry of a new generation of activists that are looking for justice in this society. We have a situation where the media, I used to be able to go to the LA Times and meet with the editorial board, go to ABC, NBC, CBS, meet with the general manager's office or the general manager themselves to say the way this coverage is happening is not okay. Now we have social media, so everybody has their channel. And depending on your orientation, you pick the channels, or the AI picks them for you, and that's what you get fed. So it takes a lot more work now to get to reality, and so what I always suggest is think about your lived experience, not what somebody is digesting for you and then turning around into a channel that you can click onto. We've become lazy. You know, you click a button and you get 10,000 answers to the question that you put into that little box on Google. The other thing is, in terms of wealth inequality, it's much worse now than it was in the 90s. In terms of race relations, it's much more complicated now. It's not just black, white, brown, yellow, and Native people, sovereign nations that we have to think about, which was the context then. Now there are multiracial, biracial people who have their own associations. We have the fact of human migration globally, not just, one of the projects Gift of Compassion is working on is supporting a sanctuary in Tijuana, in a very poor part of that city. There's a pastor that's been working for 26 years, Gustavo Banda. He and his wife, Zaida, and their teenage daughter, Hannah, have held the doors of their church open for all this time, and they currently are housing 1,200 refugees from Haiti, Central America, South America, Mexico, and last week he told me they are now receiving Ukrainian refugees. And he doesn't turn people away, unlike some of the shelters down there that give you 30 days and then you have to roll out. What is he doing? He's building tiny homes and trying to figure out how to deal with the trash and sanitation issues. And he's trying to figure out if they could finally get the little road that was just a ditch up to his sanctuary paved. When I first started going there, they were burning all their trash. Do you know how toxic that is? Yeah. So, and then the pigs and the goats and the dogs and the roosters and the chickens were all running around right there where the kids are playing. But, you know, he just kept going, and he has been blessed with a few people from UC San Diego who have helped him. Commonweal, which houses the Gift of Compassion, that's our nonprofit umbrella org. You know, 48 years ago, Commonweal began as a place where they were interested in programming for healing the individual as well as the earth. This is way before the current movement that we're all aware of now. So I feel karmically, this was the path I was to take. It was not to have read about it or to have written about it, although I have this intention. I had an intention to write a book 30 years after 92, and now I'm pushing it back to 35 years after 92. But, because I have many essays that I've put together over the years of things that I've seen and how things keep repeating. So you had police-community relations, very bad, still bad. You had media, very bad, still bad. You had wealth inequality, very bad, still bad. You had one iconic event that showcased everything. Rodney King, George Floyd. And then you just have, you know, what I back then called, like, where are the decision makers investing the dollars? They were investing in places that already had a lot of wealth in LA back then, Bunker Hill, not south of the 10 freeway, which was then called South Central LA, which is now being gentrified, you see. So in the midst of the housing crisis too, we didn't have, Skid Row used to be pretty self-contained. We now have 63,000 people on the streets of LA. Why? Because the weather is better. It's that simple. You know, the coldest it gets might be 38, but that's rare. It's usually in the 50s in the winter, much unlike here.
Right. Our problem becomes less obvious during the winter. Our version of this challenge, this social challenge. I'm struck that one thing about these last few years is that everyone now has a cell phone with a video camera and a recording power. You also opened with visualization, and when we can see the face of the other, it seems to me, this would be my hypothesis, it is more difficult to reject it and deny that that reality is happening.
Yes.
Perhaps in that there is a germ of hope that change can happen this time around at a faster pace than before?
You know, I'm really impressed by artists right now because they're conveying messages and supporting people to be more courageous and to be more creative and to imagine. You know, the whole practice of possible futures is something that our academic institutions are taking seriously because fundamentally the intention can manifest. So here we have faces. The intention of the artist is to have you feel these people. Can you feel their quality? Can you feel their common quality and their unique quality? Can you appreciate that the human face is actually our collective face? You know, the 108 has significance in Buddhism, but the 108 are only the beginning of what we are trying to convey in the gift of compassion. We don't play this because it's great art. I mean, it is great art. It is great art, but we are, this collection, by the way, is never going to be for sale. People have asked, could we buy this collection of art? And he says, no, this is sacred work. Someday, maybe all of it will be shown together. We've shown like 40 pieces, 20 pieces. But the idea is that art can convey and open the heart and the mind, like film, right? When you watch a film, you kind of, all the defenses drop, and you just kind of are there in this parallel universe. You understand what I'm saying?
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you don't judge, you just go with it. So sort of when we use this kind of device, and it is a device, I will confess, we use it to get people calmed down for the time that we will be with them. We do some physical work with them, we show them basic form, we have conversation, but this is really used to have the bodies be present and then have the minds join and the spirits join, because it takes a bit. You know, your body shows up, but your mind is over there, right? So we're trying to get them in the same space and time. And then we can start our work.
Could you tell us for a moment about the significance of the 108? I don't know that myself.
There are many things about the number 108. If anybody here is familiar with, numerology, this is a symbol for the infinite. Tutu tells me that that's how many bones are in the body or something like that. What's that? Oh, trigger points, yeah. So of course, this is another interesting thing, is that, Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, not Oriental medicine, and there's a difference. Traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, integrates not just the acupuncture, acupressure, using the trigger points, and there are, I guess, 108 in the body, but also that is, it integrates practices like Qigong, Tai Chi. It's a combination of all of it, plus the herbs and that kind of thing, and diet, and understanding how the body interacts in different seasons with the food. Here's the problem we face as a more modern society. We can get mangoes all year round. That's not natural. It's really not natural. We can get we lose touch with this very vital thing called the planet when we can just get things all year round that are actually seasonal.
You consume when you want, as the definition of a consumer.
Exactly.
Not paying attention to scarcity,
yes,
if you can overcome it with technology.
But with the 108, Tutu, am I missing anything else?
Oh yeah, 108 also means all the Tibetan temple, all the Asian temple, they build a step to 108.
Oh yeah, so again, this is 108 on the temples that are built. There's some, I think in Kabbalah, there's also some very big significance with 108. I don't know what that is, but for us it represents the infinite ways in which human beings suffer. If you see a priest holding those long chizu bead, there's 108 of them on that bead. Greed, avarice, envy, theft, homicide, all killing. All of these things are the ways in which we suffer.
You've talked about the power of this approach to setting the stage for conversation, for mediations as well. I'm just wondering if there's a particular story from a successful mediation that you would like to share with us that demonstrates this in practice.
Okay, so have you heard the concept of mirror neurons?
I have not.
So,
do tell us.
So we would call this phenomenon, which people don't appreciate or think about much, but you can actually change the vibrational quality of an interaction by how you're breathing. If I didn't have a microphone on, I'd invite everybody in this room to try an exercise, and you would see for yourself, there would be, quote, proof that your breath is powerful in a very quick demonstration. But here's the thing. With mediation, I once had a case involving a woman who had her PhD in psychology. I can't give you all of the details, but I'll give you So in the middle of the mediation, she had an episode. She was pounding on my desk. I want money. She was saying, I want money, I want money. And the person on the other side was an immigrant from Latin America who was the landlord. And both sides couldn't even consider being in the same space. So I had one at one end of the hall.
Excuse me, sorry.
And the other at the other end of the hall. And she was so loud that one of the men on the floor came running in. Ms. O, are you all right? Yes, I'm all right. And I just let her get to a place where she was pacing. And I said, okay, just take a really deep breath and exhale. And she looked at me, and then she did, and then she came and sat down. And she said, that was exactly the right thing to say to me, because if you had told me to calm down, I'm sure I would have gotten even more upset. And she said, thank you. At that point, the exhale had literally grounded her. She sat down, and we talked it through, and I said, I understand what you want, and then here's the other narrative. Because in mediations, you always have two narratives. And one thing I always tell the parties is, I cannot guarantee a settlement, but I guarantee you're going to hear new information today. Every case this has happened that I've had when it comes to discrimination, harassment, retaliation. Somebody says, I've never heard that before. They've never said that before. This is the first time I'm hearing that. So she tells me her whole story. Of course, the owner of the building didn't know the whole story, just knew there were these episodes that were happening. So once I told him the outcome, long story short, they hugged at the end. He made a personal loan to her for several $1,000s on her word that she would pay it back. And she did. I'm told she did. So you see, what happens is, if you are with somebody who's really upset, and anybody that's raised kids also would know this, right? You know, if a kid falls down, if you react, oh my God, are you okay? It scares the kid.
Gonna cry.
Yes, they will cry. But if you kind of look at them and say, okay, you gonna get up now? Come here, let me take a look. Kiss it, you know. It's not a big traumatic event. So you see, I mean, that's really simplifying it, but I'm just saying to be more conscious of how you are. We're so busy trying to control other people, right? Because we have the authority to do so, because we are a leader, because we are supposed to do this, because that's the job description. But when it comes to the kind of thing that needs to be happening right now in our society, it's a scary time for the United States, because we're seeing a shift on a global scale that is suggesting that we might not be the only superpower. We're seeing that capitalism, actually the uber-capitalist reality is what we're seeing with these multi-billionaires who really are thinking about other planets when there's a lot of stuff that could be happening right here, right now. So it's just really hard for people to grasp how we have gotten here. And my only explanation is we failed in education, you see. This is why I love this conversation. We're in a library, you know, libraries represent so much in the way of the gathering of knowledge, not necessarily wisdom, but information. And the wisdom, of course, comes from the lived experience, right? So I'm thinking about the fact that we've failed in our education mission in this society. We've made higher education too expensive for most. We've really not, you know, thought about what it means to have an uninformed public such that people will just accept anything that somebody tells them that their next door neighbor said was a good source, right? So this is our struggle. It's much more complex.
And very difficult to turn the clock back or correct,
Cannot.
you know, so...
Cannot, as
so
I said.
The alternative then is what when it comes to, you know, if we're diagnosing the problem as in part being about failures of education, not just the education system, but the education role, what is the guide? What is the...
You have to accept complexity at this point. It's 2022.
Yep.
Complexity is part of our reality, and we don't have very many tools, right? Certainly individuals find it difficult. We cannot do both and, it seems. And so here's another thing we're doing, Black, Asian, I didn't really answer that. So right now we're living in a moment of a lot of media attention on anti-Asian violence. I mean, I am the 67-year-old lady that got, beaten 127 times inside of her apartment building. Okay, when I saw that video, yes, there was an African-American assailant, but my first reaction was horror that such a thing could happen, and then this person is mentally not well.
Right.
It had nothing to do with race, but the media certainly, you see, this is where the media has such an incredible impact. Instead of highlighting the mental illness that is clearly present, even 50, slugs would have been, okay, this person is not quite there. We have no idea if this person has any animus toward an Asian woman. It could have been just an opportunistic crime, and clearly by somebody who isn't together mentally. This speaks to a systems need. Maybe there's hatred, I don't know, but I was just told yesterday that, a lot of Asian American men are arming up now. There was a videotape 2 years ago of an Asian man in a black ski mask on YouTube telling people we're going to get guns and we're going to call out the OGs to avenge this attack on our elders, right? And the guy who reached out to me is a former lifer. He's a Chinese-Cambodian guy. He's part of our reentry circle. And he said, I got to find this guy. I have to tell him this isn't the right way to go. Of course, he's not going to be able to find the guy. But out of that conversation, we decided we need to create a healing circle with, and he reached out to an African-American former prisoner who joined with him, and we created a Black Asian healing circle. The idea was to have a safe space, a welcoming space, for people to compost all of what they're seeing and experiencing. It's a structured way of engaging in this conversation, and its intent initially was to just train four sessions, and we're going to train you how to hold space like this, the both-and space. We're going to show you how to create a sacred container for receiving all of this, to deposit it, compost it, move on in life, because that's what we all have to do, belly button forward. But what has happened is the Healing Circle has been convening now for 2 years, and we have more people wanting to join this circle. So now we're spinning off other circles. We do it all on Zoom. People come on, they treat the space as sacred space. It's what we call sacred hospitality in other conversations that I'm in. And, I'm bringing this practice to places where people are having conflicts in the workplace. I'm bringing this practice to groups that are professional associations. We brought the portraits to a journalist association that was having internal leadership strife, and we planned a whole program that showed them what happens when you just randomly look at these things, and then when we give you instructions on how to look at these images and how things shift. Timing, rhythm, that's life.
Well, I'd like to get ready to take a few questions from the audience, either online or in person. If you're here in person, we have one of our staff members with a microphone. So if you just want to raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. Just while people are thinking of questions, though, there's one aspect of your life I haven't asked you about yet. You're an ordained Buddhist priest, is that correct? Well, at what point in your life did that occur? Would you tell us a little bit about that story?
It's another story, but I think it's true. I was actually getting ready for that last trial that I did, which was a double homicide involving a 17-year-old boy who had killed his mother and his 10-year-old sister. I wasn't getting any deals, no offers that we could take. And my opponent was 7 months pregnant. I think that was quite deliberate. Trial work is theater, right? So here you have a pregnant woman putting on this case. This is karma. I walk into the courtroom, which is not in LA, but outside of LA, And so it's not a home court. And the guy's name is Jimi Hendrix, who's the bailiff. He's playing Bach in the courtroom before the public is admitted into the courtroom. The court clerk, whose desk is across from the jury box, happens to be a tea candle person. She sells tea candles, I guess, on the side. And this particular judge, this is really surprising, but he let her burn a candle on her, counter. I mean, the counter's up here, she's down here at her desk, but the jury, when they're bored, what are they going to look at? They're going to see this flame. And there's a reason why we put candles in special kinds of ceremonies and when you want to have a mood that's romantic and relaxing. I walked in and saw that set up and I could not believe it, but I'm going with it. But at the same time, this was the point at which I was deciding, am I going to close my practice for good? And am I going to shift gears? And what if I do that? What will happen? What will happen? Of course, there's no answer. I'm going back and forth to Hawaii. I remember writing to my teacher on one drive into the courthouse. The courthouse was at the bottom of these mountains. And one very clear morning, I'm driving from the freeway toward the courthouse, and it just looks so small compared to the mountains. And I wrote to my teacher and I said, the courthouse just looks so small this morning. And he just wrote back, yes, it is. So, I feel like there was a moment there where I realized, yeah, this is it. This is my last trial. I'm going to do everything I can. And I picked up the gun and I said, the prosecutor, I picked it up like it's your cell phone. Just picked it up and see this? This is what the prosecutor wants you to pay attention to. But this isn't the issue. Put it down. The issue for you is what was the mental state of my client? Because to commit yourself to a guilty verdict, you have to have the act and the right mens rea, we call it, state of mind. You don't have that here. There's no evidence. You just heard from Dr. Kaiser Boyle. She just told you what his mental state was. It doesn't rise to the level of first or even second. Anyway, that was the moment in which I remember crying, going to the last part of that trial, but collecting myself in the car and then going in and doing my thing. But I think the inklings of this happened very early in my practice, when it just happened that I went to work with a former federal prosecutor who was now shifting in private practice, doing defense work, but also taking an occasional civil case. And the case that I got brought onto was a child sex molestation case for the plaintiffs. So there were 12 kids under the age of, I would say 9 as I recall, who were molested in their preschool. And we litigated that case hotly. And it ended up with a settlement because the insurance carrier came and watched the kids in deposition. We had to have a special master. We had to, set up the procedure so kids wouldn't be traumatized about being cross-examined. So we had stuffed animals, and we didn't do it at the court or in a law office. We did it in a space that was family and child-friendly. And there was a lot of controversy at the time about whether kids should be believed. At the end of the day, we were able to set up very, very healthy trust funds because the carrier said they didn't want to see these kids testify in court. They could get hit for a lot. And so that happened, and when that happened, the insurance industry shifted and it excluded these kinds of cases. So no more could you tender that kind of claim to a carrier. So you see, I started to realize how interconnected everything was, and then you forget about it, you do your practice, and then things like 92 happen, and you're in the community, and you're realizing all of this stuff is connected. And sure enough, that was the main lesson from the Zen teacher. Everything is inextricably interconnected. There can be no separation. You are me, I am you. That's the whole point of these images, which I hope we'll see again before we close.
Thank you. Any questions? We do want to use the microphone so our online audience can hear as well. So thank you.
So I think it's safe to say that we're living in an era of multiple competing victimhoods. In some cases, they're competing. And so I wanted to ask you, in your mind, what is the essence of allyship to you? Perhaps it's effective practices, and perhaps it's ineffective practices and possible principles that we might practice in our own lives as we get out there.
Yes. At every mediation that I do, I always say I feel like I have two injured parties here, which I do. Because there's the person who's brought the claim, and there's the person who's being accused of being a racist. You know, this is, especially if you don't think you are. I'm in the middle of a situation right now where that's happening, and in a very public way. So you have real grievances that I think are sincere, and then you have a human being who actually is in many victim categories himself. So, you know, it's very hard because allyship is not just signing a piece of paper saying we're an ally, and it's not just showing up. I mean, those are essential if you have the capacity to show up. Some people can't for whatever reasons. It could be health or just they're fearful of crowds. I've known people like that, but they do what they can. Allyship means that you support that which is not known to you, and you do the work of understanding, which is really, really time-consuming because your whole mindset is already in resistance unless, you know, your best friend is that person. Now, I got a call about intra-community conflict just a week ago. Progressives think we should do it this way, but the real victims think we should do it that way. And this way means we don't say anything. This way means we break silence. And, you know, I said, so have you thought of doing both? What do you mean, do both? Well, you could hold silence until this hour, and then you could break silence here. You see, people get stuck in their own narratives. They cannot see the obvious. The other thing is, when it comes to Black-Asian tensions, which is a place where there's a lot of angst around, you know, why are we not ever accepted as allies? Well, in that year that, you know, the 2,000 people were assaulted, and I'm not minimizing the anti-Asian violence or sentiment that's out there and being expressed, but the vast majority of the things that are being reported are verbal. Like, you chink, why don't you go back to where you come from? Or ching chong Chinaman. I mean, I've heard all of these, you know. And in that same year, there were over 227 deaths of Black men and women, not verbal assaults, at the hands of law enforcement. So you see, you have to bother to learn the information and hold perspective, and then also ask yourself, if we keep on this narrative that we hate Black people or Black people hate us, and believe me, I've had plenty of conversations where African Americans have said to me, okay, we had Japanese people here. They didn't cause this kind of problem. We had Jews here. They didn't cause these kind of problems. We had Chinese people here. They didn't cause these kind of problems. You Koreans, you cause problems. What's the story? You have to bother to look at the story of who these people are, who my people are. We have a very, very glorious, actually, thousands of years history. Very noble history. I mean, leaders who have sacrificed for their people and their country, and we still have a divided nation. That manifests in ways that translate to how we behave here, right? But most people also don't have friends. I got a call also last week about how do we bridge this. And the first question I asked this Asian lawyer who called, do you have any friends who are Black? I mean, really, that you could just call and say, okay, I'm struggling with this, what do you think we can do? Like Billy did when he was calling about the ski mask YouTube, you know, about getting guns, let's get the OGs. He is an OG, and he's saying, no, not the right path. Okay, so this lawyer's calling me, asking me, and I say, do you have any friends? And he had to say no. He doesn't have any friends. If you don't have any friends, then you're kind of like cut off in terms of building any foundation for yourself, I think. So allyship requires, yeah, you can sign the petition, yeah, you should go to meetings where you're welcome. By the way, if they don't talk to you 3 or 4 times, you have to keep showing up until they know you're sincere about wanting to be an ally. You need to be able to contribute if you can, whatever. If it's money or goods or, your talent, that would be helpful. And you have to study. It's another thing that you have to learn and make relationships. All of these things take time. There's no easy way. Everybody wants like the recipe. The recipe has been the same for generations. It really has been the same for generations. You have to tap into your humanity. This gesture, by the way, this gesture of palms together, it is always a sign of peace and friendship. We have these universal, you can just look at a person and give them comfort. I had a friend who had a child that was born with cerebral palsy, isolated himself, decided there's no God, there's no heaven, there's no nothing, And finally one day he shows up and decides to pull weeds, and all the teacher needed to do was drive by on a golf cart and look at him. And he felt so much better. There were no words. Sometimes there are no words. So I hope that answers your question.
We'll take one more question and then I'll check with our online audience, and then I have a couple of questions from registration. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. My question is sort of related to the same idea of allyship. We are in a library, and you spoke earlier about misinformation and each person subscribing to their own source and what that means. I struggle to communicate with the people in the same age group, the 25, the 27, the early 30s, because it seems to me everybody is right. And when you think about information, books are being banned, slavery, people don't want that to be taught in schools. And I just wonder, how do you think we bring it back to truth? How do you think we can have conversations that are honest and that the people of my generation would be willing to listen?
Ooh, that's the $64 million question, isn't it? I actually am in the middle of another dispute where there's generational shift. We're living in a time when I think your generation doesn't trust anything that exists, doesn't trust hierarchy, doesn't feel, I hear the words unsafe, triggered, traumatized. I hear bullying. These are words that are very common right now in organizational settings, even those that are mission-driven, trying to serve some public good. And people who spend their careers building those organizations, we're talking about groups that are 30 and 40 and sometimes more. The two that I'm familiar with have been around for about 40 years. And they're having this conflict because I think it's in part the pandemic that we haven't been able to work together in the same physical space. And that has a huge impact because, the vibrational quality, unless you're very sensitive, it's hard to pick up on tiles on the screen in Zoom calls. But what I'm seeing is that the same accusations are being brought against elders who are mostly white, mostly men, mostly people who have been around a long time, helped to build the org, and now have made a public, in both of these cases, public announcement that we're going to try and uplift the BIPOC communities, and even uplift non-binary, non-conforming identity community members, and to really promote them as part of our work. That has resulted in confrontation, and these are old organizations, so of course there are cultures that have existed, and there are sacred cows that nobody really talks about but exist. And so if new leadership comes in, and it's usually going to be a person of color, black or brown these days, if new leadership comes in, then you're going to have this invitation almost to dump on that person, all of the problems that have existed all along. And it manifests in, I feel like people who think they can have an easier target. It's sad to me in a way. How do you deal with this? I don't think there are any shortcuts again. So if you're part of a community where this is happening and you could find others that are interested, who are not just like you, but others who have open mind. So here's what we did. Tutu and I, we hosted a dinner series called We See You. We got the space donated in a beautiful place. We got Skid Row People's Coffee to make individual dinner boxes. We invited people to commit to a series of 4 conversations, all of them about race. Sawabona is a greeting that is translated into We See You. It's an African. I think it comes from the Zulu people. And they greet one another with this phrase, and then there's another phrase, and we see you. Because it's not just you that we see your whole lineage with you. We don't have that kind of concept here. We really don't think about lineage here, And it's too bad, because the only lineage that's recognized is, the pilgrim lineage that came here and brought what they brought, some of which was very good and some of which was disastrous for the people who were already here. But in today's world, you have people shifting all over the globe, some as refugees and some voluntarily coming. And if you're in a community where this shift is happening, that was another factor that I didn't mention. The shifting demographics contributed to 92. So demographers were already telling us that the shift was going to happen. In California, I was living it way before people on the West Coast and in the South. So that's why I could say we're ready to move beyond just black and white when we talk about race. That made the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the press back in the day. It's like, is this woman trying to ignore history? Dr. Franklin and I would be sitting together saying, wow, this is really deep. We're getting into some really, really treacherous waters, but let's keep going. There are no shortcuts. So what I'm saying to you is you have to find the other people that are willing to go into the complexity, make it somewhat enjoyable. That's why we did the dinner series, and people met one another, and we had, out of that, I'll just tell you, this Black Korean drumming event is going to happen in June. We had 2 people, African-American woman who's from Washington State and a Japanese-American man who used to be with the DOJ. They connected over him knowing her hometown, and now they're working together on a project, you see. So you just never know what happens when you bring people together with the right intention. Sometimes it's a problem-solving intention, but at other times it's just, I'd like to learn. I'd like to be able to learn to hold complexity. And there are tools that help, there's this software that exists. And I think at Stanford they have a lab that's looking at complexity. I know at MIT and at Princeton, they've a long time had these disciplines where people can, in a safe way, in a transparent way, and in a very thoughtful way, contribute their views and have them show up in what I might call thought streams. And then people who are in charge of programming or activity can actually see the thought streams and what is coming in. And you don't ever have to identify who, because when David says something in a meeting around here, automatically a lot of weight, because of what? His title. If Angela were to come in here and say the same thing, right? Because who am I in this context?
Or you get to be the expert and you'll be the lead more than I will, but I think your point is...
You get my point.
Good.
Yeah.
Do we have an online question?
We do. In these chaotic times, how can we continue to thrive when uncertainty looks threatening?
I didn't hear.
In these chaotic times, how can we continue to thrive when uncertainty looks threatening?
Meditation. You have to learn to meditate. I mean, this is the way you get to the center of a storm. In a storm, hurricanes, tornadoes, they always have a center. That's why we talk about the center, centering yourself, right? And in the center, it's very quiet. It's very peaceful. If you're a water person, you dive deep. So there's a lot of turbulence. Depending on how long you can hold your breath, you go deep, and it's very peaceful. So this is an invitation to people who are serious about, how are we going to survive, thrive. You have to have a practice, I think. It's necessary in these times. And if you don't, you may say or do something very regrettable. The guys that come out of prison who have been in for decades, they are the most thoughtful, it seems, the ones that I'm working with. They're so sensitive. They're so considerate and caring of the person next to them. I just sat with a bunch of guys on Friday night at a dinner in East LA. And it's mostly young guys, Pacific Islanders and Asians who knew each other from when they were inside. And next to me was a 75-year-old man. He had just been released. He did 19 years for murder. Didn't speak hardly any English. And because I speak conversationally Korean, I could communicate with him, and they asked me to sit with him. But he does fine. I mean, he's had to navigate the prison, and he's had to navigate his halfway house, so he's fine. All these guys are there, and here's Mr. Lee in his suit and tie. It was so touching. And everyone's having dinner. They're all talking story, sitting there. But when it comes to Mr. Lee, he stands up, straightens out his coat, and he thanks everyone for letting them, letting him be part of the dinner, and he tells his introductory story. And then he sits down, and I'm looking, and I'm noticing he's not eating his dinner. We're all masked, but everyone's eating. And then I asked him, aren't you going to eat your rice roll? Kimbap, we call it. And it's not that hard. And he kind of opens his mask, and he says, I don't have any teeth, I can't eat. Closes it, right? How do we not make sure our seniors have dental care in prison? I don't know. But so he couldn't have his dinner that night. He walked me out, and he just asked me, is there a place where I could get some help when I'm here, because they're going to deport me? He's been here many years, and because of his crime, he was a green card holder, and he is now facing possible deportation. So his wife is no more, and his son doesn't speak to him. These are the tragedies of life. And if you don't encounter them, and you're always sort of protected from meeting the person who has suffered, it is not possible to thrive. You can thrive, really, even knowing all of that. I feel that Tutu and I are so blessed. Not a day goes by where we don't say we are in gratitude. The invitation here just happens. I have a niece in this town. I'm going to get to see her, and she's had a loss of a parent recently. This is a beautiful space, and I'm so mindful of how gorgeous it is. And I'm feeling all of the energy that came to make this space possible. And, if those guys that I was with on Friday night could sit in here, they would be just awestruck and so, so moved, I know.
Angela, this might be a good place to bring our program and our conversation to a conclusion. I know we're going to end with the video one more time before we bring it to a final close. But before I thank you and just give you an opportunity and maybe an introductory sentence to the video one more time, just like a note for our audience that please pay attention to the upcoming 2 remaining sessions in the Lowell lecture series. On May 2nd, the co-founder of Life is Good, and on June 8th, the columnist and writer Eddie Glaude Jr. Just keep an eye out for those. At this point, Angela, thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Tutu, thank you for being part of this presentation and conversation. Would you like to say a closing word before we play out with the video one more time?
Yes. If you have a choice between the easy and more efficient way and the harder way, I recommend you always pick the hard way. Always. You will not regret it. Let's see the video for one last time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.